Double Dragon, Double Dragon, Double Dragon. What a wild ride this franchise has been on. Whether it's hitting the highs or stumbling through the lows, one thing remains certain. Double Dragon pioneered the entire co-op beat-em-up genre. It's a name that demands respect. So with that said, join me today as we dive deeper into one of the most fascinating chapters in the series of all. As the title of this video gives away, we're talking about none other than Super Double Dragon, the franchise's first leap onto a 16-bit home console. While it didn't exactly set the world on fire at launch, it has since developed a loyal cult following. So what's the deal? Was Super Double Dragon really too lackluster to make waves, or did gamers simply miss the boat on this one? Let's dig in and find out. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of Super Double Dragon. Is it a total embarrassment or an underrated, flawed masterpiece? Let's get into it. Yeah! If you're a Double Dragon fan, you know two things for sure. First, this franchise is massive and sprawling. Secondly, its quality has been all over the map. But here's the good news. There's never been a better time to be a Double Dragon fan. We've been treated to not one, but two fantastic doses of Bimmy and Jimmy action recently. So what a time to be alive. Many agree that we are living through a true beat-em-up renaissance, and Double Dragon Gaiden might just be the most addictive entry in the series yet. And it gets even better. Soon our beloved Lee brothers will be throwing down as playable characters in River City Girls 2. Honestly, it feels like only a matter of time before they finally smash their way onto the Super Smash Bros. Roster. But until then, here's a deal you can't pass up. You can snag Double Dragon Gaiden for an incredible 55% off, and River City Girls 2 for an astonishing 65% off by using my affiliate links. Get both of these epic brawlers for next to nothing, or up to 90% off of other thousands of AAA, indie, modern and retro titles through my link in the pinned comments. Happy shopping and huge thanks to Instant Gaming for sponsoring this video. As we've touched on before, Double Dragon's influence on gaming wasn't just big, it was monumental. The first game, directed by Yoshihisa Kishimoto of Technos Japan, didn't just break ground, it shattered it, delivering the world's first ever two-player cooperative beat-em-up and forever changing the arcade landscape. This 1987 hit put Double Dragon on the map, but something even more exciting was lurking around the corner. In 1988, Double Dragon 2, The Revenge hit the scene, and with it came not just new levels, but a whole new level of refinement. The game fixed the frustrating slowdown issues of its predecessor and introduced a fresh arsenal of moves, giving players a new sense of control and mastery over the action. This was no ordinary sequel, it was a leap forward, solidifying Double Dragon as the gold standard of its genre. These two titles didn't just stand tall on their own, they sparked a revolution. They paved the way for iconic rivals like Capcom's Final Fight, Sega's Golden Axe, and Konami's Crime Fighters. The beat-em-up era had arrived, and Double Dragon was the blueprint. But as fantastic as this era was, sadly, winter was coming. By the time Double Dragon 3 hit the scene, the glory days for Technos were coming to a grinding halt. The company started making one questionable decision after another, and their next move would be a game changer, but not in the way fans hoped. Unlike its predecessors, Double Dragon 3 The Rosetta Stone wasn't directed by Yoshihisa Kishimoto, nor was it even developed in-house by Technos. Instead, it was outsourced to East Technology, and the result? A game so far removed from the original Double Dragon formula that it felt almost unrecognisable. But that wasn't the only twist in this tale. Over on the NES, a different game, Double Dragon 3 The Sacred Stones, was also released. Unlike the previous entries, which were in essence reimaginings of the arcade games with more platforming elements, this one was a completely new experience, though sadly it too was riddled with issues, leaving players frustrated and disappointed. But as low a point as this was, what is most poignant in this video is with regards to what came next in this once mighty series. After the 1990 release of Double Dragon 3 in arcades, a harsh reality hit Technos. The arcade business was in decline. Foot traffic was shrinking, and even the game's controversial microtransaction in-game store couldn't save it. In fact, it did more harm than good, frustrating players to the point where the feature was completely dropped from the Japanese release. The message was clear, the golden era of arcades was fading. Faced with this new landscape, Technos made a bold decision. Rather than doubling down on another arcade installment, they pivoted the series toward the booming world of home consoles. with the NES revolutionising console gaming and potentially siphoning away arcade profits, shifting focus to Nintendo hardware seemed like the smartest move. And with the Super Nintendo poised to be a massive success, the stage was set for Double Dragon to make its next big move. But how would this shift in direction impact the series? Was Technos about to reclaim its former glory, or was this just the beginning of the end? Let's take a closer look at what came next for Double Dragon in the world of home consoles. While the future of Double Dragon very much seemed like it should be in the home, there was one major bump in the road. If you've seen my previous video, you'll know that the NES version of Double Dragon 3 didn't exactly fly off the shelves. In fact, it sold so poorly that Western publisher Acclaim was left with over 500,000 unsold copies. This misstep led to the end of the partnership between Acclaim and Technos, and in its place, a new alliance with Trade West was formed. Trade West would now be responsible for manufacturing and distributing Technos' games across Europe and North America. Aside from this change in publisher, Technos had also seemed to learn from their past development mistakes too. Unlike the outsourced arcade version of Double Dragon 3, the next game, Super Double Dragon, would be developed in-house, giving Technos more control over every aspect of the project. At this point, everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. But was this truly the franchise's return to form, or would unforeseen changes lie ahead? Let's dig deeper into the making of Super Double Dragon to uncover what really happened. Away from Double Dragon, Technos were delivering decent pro wrestling games. After the success of WWF WrestleFest, a shift occurred within Technos that would impact the future of the Double Dragon franchise. The series creator Yoshihisa Kishimoto was promoted from his director role to that of a producer, leaving someone new to take the reins of Super Double Dragon. Enter Maneki Ebenuma, a passionate fan of the franchise who had specifically joined Technos with the dream of working on future Double Dragon projects. Now, with a director's chair in his hands, it was time for Ebenuma and his team to bring their vision of Super Double Dragon to life. Rather than continuing the storyline from the previous Double Dragon games, Super Double Dragon takes a different approach. It feels more like a reboot. Once again, we're introduced to martial arts masters Billy and Jimmy Lee, who set off to rescue Marion from the clutches of a Shadow Warrior gang. Curiously, despite this familiar setup, Marion never actually makes an appearance in the game itself. Instead, her involvement is hinted at in the instruction manual and packaging, giving us the basic story we know. At first glance, Super Double Dragon retains many of the core elements that made the series iconic. It's still a two-player cooperative beat-em-up with the Lee brothers battling through various stages in search of Marion. As you'd expect from a 16-bit title, the game boasts graphical improvements over its predecessors, yet its art style stays true to the earlier console games. Unlike Double Dragon 3 in the arcades, which took a completely different visual direction, Super Double Dragon feels like a return to familiar territory. But is that enough? Let's see. When it comes to gameplay, Super Double Dragon builds on the series' familiar mechanics. Punching, kicking and jumping are all back in action, but with the Super Nintendo's more advanced controller and its expanded button layout, players now have the ability to guard against attacks. If timed correctly, pressing the guard button not only blocks an enemy's punch, but can also trigger an arm grab, leaving certain enemies wide open for a punishing follow-up attack. An aspect of the game we will touch more on soon. But that's not all. Super Double Dragon introduces the Dragon Power Gauge, a new feature located beneath the life bar. By holding down the L and R button, players can charge this meter, which unleashes devastating special attacks when activated. The strength of these moves depends on how full the gauge is, and once it's maxed out, even regular attacks deal bonus damage for a short period, giving players an edge in tough battles. Another notable change is that, for the first time in the series, Billy and Jimmy aren't just palette swaps of each other. In Super Double Dragon, they're distinguished, not only by their different hairstyles, but also by their unique fighting abilities. Each brother has his own moveset, adding a new layer of strategy and variety to the gameplay. So how do these changes affect the Double Dragon formula? Let's look at more of what this game has to offer, and see what makes Super Double Dragon stand out in the series. For long-term fans of these games on home consoles, Super Double Dragon brings back the classic Mode A and Mode B options. Mode A lets players accidentally, or not so accidentally, to be able to hurt each other while playing cooperatively, while Mode B ensures you can't. Whether you want a harmonious team-up or prefer to annoy your sibling might just dictate your choice here. From the very start, the game sets the stage with a stunning street scene, complete with neon lights and vibrant casinos in the background. it's hard not to draw comparisons to Streets of Rage, so either the director was a big fan of Sega's hit, or both games took inspiration from a common source, the film Streets of Fire, which also heavily influenced Final Fight. Soon enough, the action shifts into the casino itself, which, while less visually exciting, still captures the atmosphere with fruit machines dotting the backdrop. Before long, players find themselves in a classic beat-em-up scenario. A lift section, but Super Double Dragon adds a twist. Enemies don't just stand around waiting for a beating, they leap onto your lift from a different one, giving this section a fresh sort of feel. As the action moves deeper into the casino, as is typical with nearly every beat-em-up I've ever played, the environment takes on a more Trump Tower aesthetic, with these ornate settings functioning as iconic backdrops in these sort of games. Keeping in mind that it includes areas like this, Super Double Dragon feels right at home in the beat-em-up world. But how does it stack up against the series' legendary predecessors? Let's keep digging and find out. As players progress, the end of this section serves up a boss fight against a suit-clad martial artist simply named Steve. Unfortunately, there's no boss music to signal the intensity of the moment, so if you didn't know better, you'd think he was just another run-of-the-mill enemy, but more on this strange flaw very shortly. Next up, we find ourselves in an airport departure lounge where the stage's music and ambience are a noticeable improvement, setting a great tone for the action. After a solid round of brawling through the terminal, players eventually hit the runway itself, throwing punches and kicks right in front of the plane. Apparently, airport security in 1992 was pretty relaxed. No one seems to care about a full-on street fight happening besides an aircraft. Nowadays, the trust between airlines and passengers has eroded so much that I can't even bring a can of Coke in my bag without them worrying I might blow up the plane. Honestly, it feels like we've gone backwards. No one trusts anyone anymore. Players must take on a boss here called Jackson, a former boxing champion, but again, he doesn't really feel like a boss. His sprite size and the absence of any boss music makes him seem like just another guy in the crowd. Beating him leads to a strange stage transition where the plane takes off right beside the player, and soon you're thrown into a fight in a gritty city slum. Classic beat-em-up territory really, very Final Fight. In this Chinatown-like setting, players soon find themselves entering a mysterious building that looks like a Kempo gym. What secrets might be hidden inside? As players begin their ascent, they notice something familiar. Previous boss enemies reappear, but now as regular sprites. On the roof, the suspense builds as players confront the stage bosses, twin martial arts masters who own the gym. The twins, Ron Fu in a yellow vest and Ron Poyo in red, each have their own unique fighting styles. Ron Fu specialises in kicks, twisting the player's legs with a single grab, while Ron Poyo counters with brutal punches. Stage 4 ramps up the excitement by placing players atop a speeding lorry, with the background scrolling past to emphasise the vehicle's dangerous speed. But in a surprising twist, the lorry crashes, hurling the players into the streets below. As players regroup, they face off against a large boss who introduces a new challenge, a Sonic the Hedgehog style spin jump attack. Just when it seems like the fight is reaching its climax, the boss escapes, leaving players to confront a shocking twist, a doppelganger of the Lee brothers who can perform all the moves from their iconic arsenal. Stage 5 cranks up the nostalgia as players brawl through an industrial area set to a nostalgic remix from the original Double Dragon. The blend of classic beats with hard-hitting action is nothing short of awesome, and is easily my favourite part of the game so far. Picture this, fighting through stairwells, tossing barrels and relishing in iconic throwbacks. It's pure unfiltered Double Dragon goodness. The tension rises as the stage culminates in a rematch with a boss who narrowly escaped in Stage 4. This time though, he won't be so lucky. Players finally get the chance to knock him out and claim victory. But just when the adrenaline starts to settle, Stage 6 pulls you into the dense, shadowy forest. It's another setting the series is known for, but this time the stakes are higher. The rickety drawbridge dares you to make every leap count, as some planks fall beneath your feet, turning what might seem like a simple platforming section into a nerve-wracking test of timing and precision. The stage may be short, but it makes sure to keep you on your toes. As you approach the enemy's lair, a towering gatekeeper stands in your way, unleashing his infamous death leg, a devastating middle kick that even his comrades fear. Now we arrive at the climactic final stage, the enemy's hideout. If you're a fan of the classic Double Dragon games, this stage will hit you right in the nostalgia. It's a faithful homage to the closing stages of the first two games, with many familiar elements making a triumphant return. But don't be fooled, this is more than just a nod to the past. The gameplay ramps up here, delivering the kind of intense action you expect from a final showdown. Prepare yourself for a brutal boss rush as you face off against all the enemies who've crossed your path before, each more determined than the last. The action doesn't let up as waves of enemies swarm you in typical beat-em-up fashion, keeping you on high alert. Then comes the lift section, because what would a final stage be without it? It's a classic feature of the genre, and just when you think you've cleared it, more enemies flood in, ensuring there's never a dull moment. But here's the kicker, this stage is huge. In fact, it's as long as the entire rest of the game combined. That's right, buckle up, because you're in for an extended battle that pushes your skills and endurance to their limit. After surviving this challenge, at last players find themselves in what feels like a full circle moment, the same room where the final showdown occurred in the first 2 Double Dragon games. But don't get too comfortable, here comes another boss rush. Every boss you've faced throughout the game comes back for one final round, forcing you to muster every bit of skill and strategy you've gained along the way. At least this section is set to a fantastic remix of another classic track from the series, adding a nostalgic energy that drives you forward. The true final challenge? Duke, the last and toughest opponent. With his flashy martial arts style, Duke proves to be a formidable foe, pushing players to their limits in a long, drawn-out battle. But here's the tragically disappointing part. Once you finally defeat him, the screen fades to black, and that's it. No cutscenes, no grand reveal, no rescue sequence for Marion, nothing. The game is over, with no explanation who Duke even is, or any form of closure to the story. Once the game is over, it's over, and leads to a rather abrupt conclusion. Past this point, the credits simply roll, leaving the true ending up to your imagination. A decision that, for better or worse, leaves things on a somewhat ambiguous note, begging the question, what exactly happened here? The short answer is that Ebenuma and his team simply ran out of time. They were unable to complete all the finishing touches before the game had to be released, which explains the absence of both an intro and an outro, something you typically expect from a Double Dragon game. As a result, the game feels like it could have used a bit more polish in certain areas. It's a classic case of potential slightly undercut by time constraints, which leaves you wondering what might have been if the team had been able to fully realise their vision. This is why the game has neither an intro or an outro, like most other Double Dragon games, and why it feels like it could have done with a bit more tuning in places. But something else that's worth noting is that there is actually more than one version of the game, with the Western and Japanese releases of the title being quite different from one another, with them even holding different names. There are a few key differences between the Western Super Double Dragon and the Japanese Return of Double Dragon. Most notably, the music tracks are shuffled between the two versions, and Return features several gameplay tweaks that the Western version lacks. For instance, in Return, players can retrieve their boomerang after throwing it, and the Hurricane kick hits multiple times in succession. The enemy and weapon placement also differ between versions, with slight adjustments to the damage dealt and received. And that massive grueling final level, it's only that long in Return of Double Dragon. The Western version's final stage is significantly shorter, despite being released 2 weeks earlier than its Japanese counterpart. Additionally, Return allows players to adjust the game's difficulty, whereas the Western release locks everyone into a single difficulty setting. These subtle differences make each version feel distinct, adding another layer for dedicated fans to explore. But whichever version you play, that epic final fight with Duke will leave you on the edge of your seat, even if the ending itself leaves you wanting more. Back in 1992, Super Double Dragon received lukewarm reviews from publications like Nintendo Power and Superplay magazine, with both outlets labelling it as a decent but ultimately underwhelming entry in the series. In 2004, Maneki Ebenuma, the game's director and die-hard Double Dragon fan, reflected on the project in a candid commentary. Ebenuma expressed regrets that he wasn't able to fully realise his vision due to the strict development timeline imposed by Technos Japan. According to Ebenuma, this wasn't part of the original plan. There were supposed to be cutscenes before boss fights and between stages, adding depth to the story of the Lee brothers investigating the Shadow Warriors gang after several prominent martial artists went missing. The narrative would have revealed Duke, the final game's boss, as a childhood friend of the Lee brothers, who had betrayed them, a far more layered and emotional storyline than the game's final version presents. Building on all of this, Marion, as staple character in the series, was also intended to play a much larger role. Drawing inspiration from the Double Dragon comic series, she was envisioned as a police officer, working alongside the Lee brothers in their mission. However, due to the rushed development, her involvement was drastically cut, and she was reduced to a brief mention in the game's instruction manual. Ebenuma's commentary sheds light on the what could have been of Super Double Dragon, a game that with a bit more time and polish might have delivered a richer narrative experience and deeper emotional connection. Instead, it stands as a title with flashes of greatness, but ultimately unfinished potential. If Maneki Ebenuma had been given more time to work on Super Double Dragon, the improvements would have gone beyond just story as well. He envisioned adding more traps and obstacles to the stages, giving the game a variety that would have elevated it beyond the standard brawler formula. The rushed development timeline imposed by Technos resulted in a half-baked product that fell short of its potential. Even the 2 extra weeks the Japanese version received compared to the Western release show what a little more time could have done for the game. Those minor tweaks and adjustments were just a glimpse of the improvements Maneki could have made with a full extension. However, the game's lack of polish wasn't the only issue that made Super Double Dragon a disappointment for Technos. By the time it was released, the beat-em-up genre was evolving rapidly, and Double Dragon simply couldn't keep pace. On home consoles, Super Double Dragon couldn't compete with the heavy hitters of the time like Golden Axe or Streets of Rage, let alone Streets of Rage 2, which was also released that same year. These games set a new standard for the genre, leaving Double Dragon behind as an outdated relic. Technos' decision to rush the game out the door ended up being a major misstep, as it prevented Super Double Dragon from standing up to its competitors. What could have been a standout entry in the series was instead overshadowed by prettier beat-em-ups that pushed the genre forward on home consoles, whereas graphically at least, Double Dragon remained somewhat stuck in the past. What makes this all the more frustrating is that mechanically at least, it is quite an innovative game, featuring a more pragmatic style of play than many of its contemporaries. Although slow looking in comparison to the most popular beat-em-ups of the era, the game was programmed to play deliberately slow to complement its counter-based gameplay. The block and counter mechanic, allowing players to block attacks and retaliate in real time, makes it feel more like a martial arts experience than, say, Streets of Rage. This more thoughtful approach to combat was ahead of its time, even if it didn't resonate as strongly with the arcade crowds who preferred faster action. Adding to this, players could even change fighting stances affecting movesets and allowing for a more tactical approach to encounters compared to the more straightforward mechanics of other games like, say, Final Fight. These nuances are one of the reasons why there is such a large crowd of individuals out there who respect the game today, despite its many shortcomings. But regardless of whether you preferred the slower, more methodical pace in this game or not, I don't really think it impacted the sales. In my opinion, other big games in the beat-em-up genre weren't even its biggest hindrance either. The title's main lack of appeal came from the fact that it had just been released on the Super Nintendo alongside another game that included fighting mechanics that revolutionised the industry forever. I'm of course talking about Street Fighter 2, the game that caused many consumers to buy a Super Nintendo in the first place. It arrived months earlier in most places before Super Double Dragon on the device, meaning that by the time Super Double Dragon did arrive, it looked extremely basic and rudimentary in comparison, even in reality that it wasn't necessarily the case. For the casual market at least, these were both martial arts games that included a lot of fighting, and one of them seemed far more impressive looking than the other, and whom could blame them for feeling this way? Essentially, despite it being in some ways a flawed masterpiece, Super Double Dragon was a half-baked, rushed product that simply couldn't compete with what else was available on the market at the time. Technos managed to screw up once again, perhaps even worse than with Double Dragon 3. It was becoming quite sad to watch a franchise that had once been so groundbreaking sink further into mediocrity with each new release, even if a decent level of creativity and effort had been put in this time around. On a more positive note though, Super Double Dragon did remain faithful to the gameplay, art direction and music of the first 2 games created by Yoshihisa Kishimoto. This is more than can be said for Double Dragon 3, which strayed far from the series' roots. In fact, from a graphical standpoint, Super Double Dragon looks like a natural progression of the first 2 games, almost as if the original Double Dragon title had been given the Super Mario All-Stars treatment of the Super Nintendo. So in that sense, it feels in line with what came before it. If you're craving an experience that feels like an NES Double Dragon game, but on the Super Nintendo, Super Double Dragon might be the game for you. However, such a concept didn't exactly feel nostalgic or exciting in 1992, and simply wasn't as exciting as the emerging fighting game genre of the period, or as flashy looking as other beat-em-ups of the period for that matter either. At the time, when the beat-em-up genre was evolving rapidly and the fighting game genre was on the rise, Super Double Dragon was left in the dust, offering up what was little more to most than ultimately an uninspired trip down memory lane, even if the mechanics themselves are indeed pretty innovative. Retrospectively, I would say that due to the poor sales and the fact that Technos Japan didn't even finish the game before Trade West published it, this indicates a pretty embarrassing situation. But due to the unique combat mechanics and the Double Dragon charm, there is still an audience out there who look at this one as a flawed masterpiece. Despite its shortcomings, in November of 2023, Super Double Dragon will finally see a re-release on modern hardware. But what made this even more enjoyable for some is that it has some new features. This includes the new play speed function, which allows for higher throttle combat, planned at up to twice the speed for even more turbocharged tussles. If you play this version of the game, you can't complain anymore about this one being too slow. No matter which version of the game you do play though, despite its flaws, Super Double Dragon has a passionate fanbase because of its more complex fighting mechanics, which include blocking, counters, and a variety of moves, offering a deeper experience than other simpler beat-em-ups. The potential of this game and its unique combat system, even if not fully realised, has left a lasting impression on fans, so for these reasons, it remains beloved by some. Don't forget I can get you a huge discount on both Double Dragon Gaiden and River City Girls 2, as well as massive money off of thousands of other games simply by using my affiliate links via the pinned comment. Happy shopping and cheerio.